The train whistle pierced the crisp autumn air of 1875 as Beatrice King clutched her worn leather satchel and peered nervously through the window at the approaching Snowflake, Arizona Territory Station. Her life savings had paid for the train ticket west and the small fee to the marriage broker who'd promised her a husband and a new beginning far from the grief she'd left behind in Boston. The conductor's voice rang out, "Snowflake, next stop," as the train began to slow. Beatrice's hands trembled as she straightened her simple blue traveling dress, now wrinkled from the 5-day journey. The letter in her pocket, read 100 times over, contained the promises of one Franklin Owens, a cattle rancher who sought a respectable Eastern lady of good character to share in the building of a prosperous homestead. The photograph he'd sent showed a stern-faced man, perhaps 20 years her senior, but Beatrice, at 23, had few options left after her parents' deaths and the subsequent loss of their millinery shop to creditors. The train lurched to a halt, sending Beatrice stumbling slightly as she gathered her belongings, one trunk containing everything she'd managed to salvage from her former life. The conductor helped her down onto the wooden platform where a biting wind immediately cut through her light coat, woefully inadequate for the unexpectedly cold Arizona autumn. She scanned the small gathering of people waiting at the station, looking for the face from the photograph. A minute passed, then 5, then 15. As passengers dispersed and the platform cleared, Beatrice remained alone, save for the station master who cast increasingly pitying glances in her direction. "Miss, you waiting on someone?" he finally asked, approaching with a sympathetic expression. "Yes, sir, Mr. Franklin Owens. He's expecting me, his mail-order bride." The words felt strange on her tongue, an admission of desperation she'd never imagined making. The station master's face fell. "Miss, I'm afraid I have some difficult news. Franklin Owens passed away 3 weeks ago." Influenza took him quick-like. The words hit Beatrice like physical blows. Dead. The man she'd never met but had pinned all her hopes upon was dead. Her trunk suddenly seemed impossibly heavy beside her. "I sent telegrams to cancel any arrangements," the station master continued, "but I suppose if you were already traveling." Beatrice swayed slightly, her mind racing. She had exactly $4.37 to her name, not nearly enough for a return ticket to Boston, where nothing awaited her anyway. Is there perhaps a boarding house where I might stay until I can arrange something?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "The widow Johnson takes in boarders, but—" The station master hesitated. "Times are hard, miss. She requires payment in advance and works scarce for a lady such as yourself." Beatrice sank onto her trunk, the reality of her situation crashing down upon her. The station master muttered something about checking on freight and disappeared inside, leaving her alone as the afternoon shadows lengthened and the temperature dropped further. The first tear fell silently, followed quickly by another, until Beatrice sat weeping openly on her trunk, shoulders shaking with the force of her sobs. She had gambled everything on this journey, and now she faced destitution in a strange town where she knew not a soul. She didn't notice the approaching horseman until his mount's hooves clattered to a stop nearby. Through tear-blurred eyes, she saw tall leather boots, dusty denim, and then a man crouching before her. "Madam." His voice was deep, with the Western inflection she'd been hearing since crossing the Mississippi. "You all right?" Beatrice attempted to compose herself, wiping futilely at her tears. "I'm fine, thank you," she managed, the lie transparent even to her own ears. The man said nothing for a moment, just studied her with eyes the color of a summer sky. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 28 or 30, with sun-weathered skin and sandy brown hair that curled slightly where it met his collar. "You're Franklin's bride," he stated rather than asked, his expression unreadable. A fresh wave of tears threatened. "I was to be. The station master just informed me of his passing." The man nodded grimly. "Frank was a good man, worked the next property over from mine." He glanced at the darkening sky, then at her insufficient coat. In a fluid motion, he shrugged out of his heavy canvas duster and settled it around her shoulders. The unexpected warmth and weight of it startled Beatrice, as did the man's gentleness as he arranged it to cover her properly. "Stay," he said simply, his hand briefly touching her shoulder. "Don't go rushing off anywhere tonight. Let me think on this." He straightened to his full height, and Beatrice had to crane her neck to look up at him. "I'm Kurt Whitaker," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Beatrice King," she replied, accepting his handshake. His grip was firm but careful, as though he was conscious of his strength. Kurt nodded once. "Miss King, I'll fetch my wagon and take you to Widow Johnson's for tonight. Tomorrow we can sort out what's to be done." Before she could respond, he was striding toward the hitching post where his horse waited. Beatrice clutched his coat around her, inhaling the scent of leather, horses, and some indefinable spice. For the first time since stepping off the train, she felt a small flicker of hope. True to his word, Kurt returned within 20 minutes driving a sturdy wagon. He loaded her trunk with ease and helped her climb onto the wooden seat beside him. As they pulled away from the station, Beatrice cast one last glance backward, wondering if she'd made yet another terrible mistake trusting a stranger in this wild country. The ride to Widow Johnson's boarding house took them through Snowflake proper. Despite her distress, Beatrice couldn't help noticing the frontier town's determined attempts at civilization: a church with a proper steeple, a two-story schoolhouse, several mercantile establishments, and even a small bank. It was larger than she'd expected, though still modest compared to Boston. "Town's growing," Kurt commented, following her gaze. "The railroad coming through last year brought new folks. We've even got a proper doctor now, not just the barber who used to pull teeth when he wasn't cutting hair." Beatrice managed a weak smile at his attempt at humor. "It seems quite established." "It's becoming so," he agreed. "Though out where most of us ranch, it's still pretty wild. Frank's place," he stopped abruptly. "Well, that's a matter for tomorrow." The Widow Johnson turned out to be a stern-faced woman of about 50 with sharp eyes that assessed Beatrice's worth in seconds. But when Kurt explained the situation in low tones, something in the older woman's face softened. "Of course she can stay tonight," she said. "Any girl who's traveled this far deserves at least a proper bed and hot meal before facing more troubles." She named a price that made Beatrice's heart sink, knowing it would consume more than half her meager funds. Kurt reached into his pocket before Beatrice could speak. "I'll cover her lodging for the week," he said firmly, ignoring Beatrice's startled protest. "Put it on my account, Mrs. Johnson." "That's not necessary," Beatrice began, but Kurt silenced her with a gentle look. "Miss King, I was Frank's neighbor and friend. Let me do this small thing in his memory." He tipped his hat to both women. "I'll return tomorrow morning to help you sort your arrangements." With that, he was gone, leaving Beatrice standing in the tidy foyer with her trunk and his coat still draped around her shoulders. She realized too late she hadn't returned it. "Well, come along then," Widow Johnson said briskly. "Supper's at 6 sharp. I'll show you to your room." The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, washstand, and small desk. The window overlooked a kitchen garden, now mostly harvested for the coming winter. Beatrice sat on the edge of the bed after Widow Johnson departed, Kurt's coat still clutched around her like armor against the increasingly uncertain future. She wept again, but this time silently, without the racking sobs of despair that had overtaken her at the station. When the bell rang for supper, she washed her face, pinned her hair more neatly, and descended to join the other boarders, two elderly sisters who taught at the school, a young bank clerk, and a traveling salesman who sold sewing machines throughout the territory. The meal passed in a blur as Beatrice responded politely to curious questions about Boston and her journey west. She answered truthfully about coming as a mail-order bride, but omitted the devastating news about Franklin's death. Something in her couldn't bear their pity just yet. After helping Widow Johnson clear the dishes, an automatic gesture that earned her an approving nod, Beatrice returned to her room and spent a sleepless night contemplating her limited options. By morning, she had resolved to seek employment in town, perhaps as a seamstress or shop assistant, until she could save enough for a ticket elsewhere. To where, she hadn't decided. Kurt arrived as promised after breakfast, his tall frame filling the doorway of Widow Johnson's parlor where Beatrice waited. He'd brought a warmer coat for himself, she noticed, but when she tried to return his duster, he shook his head. Keep it for now. The mornings are cold here. Mr. Whitaker, I cannot accept your charity indefinitely, Beatrice said firmly. I intend to find employment in town. Let's talk, he interrupted, gesturing toward the porch. Mrs. Johnson, may we use your sitting area out front? Once settled in the wooden rocking chairs, Kurt got straight to the point. I rode by Frank's place yesterday evening after leaving you. It's a good property, 300 acres, decent house, small herd of about 60 cattle. Nothing's been decided about it yet, since Frank's only kin is a nephew back east who's never even been to the territory. Beatrice listened, unsure where this was leading. Frank paid your passage, bought your contract fair and square, Kurt continued. By rights, the property should be partly yours, Beatrice blinked in surprise. But we weren't married, I never even met the man. Doesn't matter much out here, law's still catching up to civilization. Kurt leaned forward, his expression earnest. Look, Miss King, I'm not a lawyer, but I do know that mail-order arrangements are considered binding contracts in these parts. You fulfilled your end by coming all this way. Hope fluttered briefly in Beatrice's chest before common sense squashed it. Even if that were true, I know nothing about ranching. I couldn't possibly. That's what I'm getting to, Kurt interrupted. I've been thinking on this all night. I need help with my place. It's growing faster than I can manage alone. I hire hands for roundup and such, but what I really need is someone year-round. He took a deep breath. I'm proposing a business arrangement. You stay at Frank's place, which adjoins mine, and help me manage both properties. I'll teach you what you need to know. In return, you get a roof over your head and a share of the profits. Beatrice stared at him, speechless. After a moment, she found her voice. Mr. Whitaker, that's very generous but highly improper. A woman living alone on a ranch, working alongside a man who isn't her husband. The scandal would be immense. Kurt's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. Miss King, this isn't Boston. Out here, folks are practical. But if it eases your mind, Widow Johnson's niece Martha could stay with you as a companion. She's 16 and smart as a whip, been wanting to learn ranching herself. Beatrice's mind raced, weighing impossibilities against desperate alternatives. And what happens when Frank's nephew decides to claim his inheritance? By then, you'll either have established your own claim or saved enough to move on, whichever you prefer, Kurt replied. I'm not offering charity, Miss King. Ranching's hard work. I'm offering a fair exchange. The practicality of it appealed to Beatrice's New England sensibilities, yet the arrangement seemed fraught with complications. May I have time to consider it? Of course. Kurt stood. But not too long. Winter's coming and there's work to be done before the first snow. Beatrice spent the day walking through Snowflake, ostensibly looking for employment but actually considering Kurt's proposition. She visited the general store, where the proprietor sympathetically informed her he had no positions available. The dressmaker already had 2 assistants. The hotel needed a maid, but the pay was meager and the hours long. By late afternoon, she found herself at the small church, its empty quietness offering respite from her tumultuous thoughts. She wasn't particularly religious, but the silence felt like a space to breathe. "Troubles, child." The voice startled her. An older man in clerical clothing stood in the aisle. "Just thinking, Reverend," Beatrice replied. "Sometimes thinking becomes its own burden." He sat in the pew across from her. "You're new to Snowflake." "Yes, I arrived yesterday." Beatrice hesitated, then found herself relating her entire story to this stranger, including Kurt's unexpected proposition. The minister listened without interruption. When she finished, he nodded thoughtfully. "Kurt Whitaker is a good man, honest and hardworking. His wife died in childbirth 4 years ago along with the babe. He's kept to himself since then, focused on building his ranch." This new information shifted something in Beatrice's understanding. "He didn't mention a wife." "Kurt doesn't speak of personal matters easily," the Reverend said. "But I tell you this so you understand he knows something of loss, as do you." He paused. "As for propriety, having Martha Johnson as a companion would satisfy even the most gossip-prone members of my congregation. And frankly, Miss King, ranching might suit you better than you think. There's healing in working the land." By evening, Beatrice had made her decision. She would accept Kurt's offer temporarily, she told herself, until a better opportunity presented itself, or until Franklin's nephew made his claim. Kurt seemed unsurprised when she informed him the next morning. "Good," was all he said. "We'll ride out today so you can see the place. If you still want to proceed after that, we can move your things tomorrow." Franklin Owen's ranch was a 12-mile ride from town. Beatrice, who'd never ridden astride before, found herself perched somewhat uncomfortably on a gentle mare Kurt had borrowed from a friend. The journey took them through rolling grasslands broken by stands of ponderosa pine, with the distant mountains forming a magnificent backdrop against the azure sky. The ranch itself was modest, but solid, a main house built of squared logs with a proper shingled roof, a barn, several corrals and outbuildings. It wasn't the crude frontier cabin Beatrice had feared, but neither was it luxurious. "Frank built it himself, mostly," Kurt explained as he helped her dismount. "Added on as he could afford to, started with just 1 room. The interior was plain but tidy, with signs of hasty departure by whoever had cleaned after Franklin's death. A main room served as kitchen and living area, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall. 2 small bedrooms branched off from it, along with a lean-to that housed a washroom of sorts. "It's rustic," Beatrice managed, taking it all in. Kurt's expression flickered with something like doubt. "It's not what you're used to, I expect." "No," she admitted, "but it's far better than I feared." She walked to the window, looking out at the vast landscape. "Where is your ranch from here?" Kurt pointed northwest, "just over that rise." "About a mile as the crow flies. We share water rights to the creek that runs between the properties." They spent the rest of the day touring the ranch, Kurt patiently explaining the operation while Beatrice tried to absorb the overwhelming amount of information. The cattle, the seasonal routines, the essential tasks that kept a ranch functioning, it was a world entirely foreign to her. By the time they returned to town, Beatrice was exhausted but surprisingly invigorated. The physical exertion, the clean air, the enormity of the landscape all had worked some indefinable change in her outlook. True to his word, Kurt arranged for Martha Johnson to accompany Beatrice as a companion. The girl was delighted at the prospect, having grown restless under her aunt's strict supervision in town. 2 days later, Beatrice found herself officially installed at the Owens Ranch, now temporarily hers, by Kurt's insistence, with Martha chattering excitedly about the adventures ahead. The first week was a brutal education. Beatrice's hands, soft from urban living, developed blisters that broke and bled as she learned to chop wood, haul water, and manage the myriad daily chores required to maintain the household. Martha, despite her youth, proved invaluable, having grown up helping her aunt with similar work. Kurt appeared each morning at dawn, teaching both women the basics of ranch management. He was patient but exacting, expecting them to learn quickly and work hard. He never spoke of personal matters, maintaining a polite but distinct reserve that Beatrice found both frustrating and oddly comforting. This was indeed a business arrangement, not some romantic notion. The arrival of Martha's brother, 18-year-old Thomas, added another dimension to their small community. Kurt hired him to help with the heavier ranch work, allowing him to stay in the bunkhouse on his own property. The young man's presence meant they could manage more efficiently, with Thomas handling tasks requiring greater strength while Beatrice focused on learning livestock management, and Martha maintained the household. By the third week, a routine had established itself. Beatrice rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, often with Kurt joining them as he outlined the day's work. They would separate to their tasks, Beatrice usually accompanying Kurt to learn about the cattle, fences, water sources, and other ranch essentials, while Martha and Thomas handled other chores. Despite her initial doubts, Beatrice found herself adapting more readily than expected. The physical work, though exhausting, brought a satisfaction she'd never experienced in Boston. Each new skill mastered, from identifying a sick calf to mending fence, gave her a sense of accomplishment that sustained her through the harder moments. One evening in early November, as the first serious cold snap descended on the territory, Beatrice sat by the fire repairing a torn shirt of Kurt's that Martha had included in the wash. Kurt had stayed for supper, as he occasionally did when work ran late, and was reviewing accounts at the table while Thomas cleaned guns and Martha kneaded bread for the next day. The domesticity of the scene struck Beatrice suddenly, how quickly they had formed this odd family unit of sorts. Kurt must have felt her gaze, for he looked up from his ledger. "Something wrong, Miss King?" She shook her head, smiling slightly. "Not at all. I was just thinking how different this all is from what I expected when I left Boston." Kurt's expression softened momentarily. Disappointment or improvement? The question caught her off guard with its directness. "Different," she repeated, "but not entirely unwelcome." A ghost of a smile touched his lips before he returned to his figures. Beatrice found herself watching him surreptitiously as she sewed the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the careful precision with which he recorded each entry. For all his rugged exterior, there was a meticulous mind at work. Later, as he prepared to leave for his own ranch, a sudden snowfall began. Beatrice stood on the porch watching the thick flakes swirl in the lantern light. "First real snow of the season," Kurt commented, pulling on his gloves. "Might want to bring in extra firewood before turning in." "Could be a cold night." "I will," Beatrice promised. "Ride safely, Mr. Whitaker." He paused, regarding her for a long moment. "Might be time to call me Kurt, don't you think? Considering we're business partners of a sort." The simple suggestion felt momentous somehow. "Then you must call me Beatrice." He nodded once. "Beatrice." He said her name carefully, as though testing the sound of it. "Good night." She watched him ride away, the snow quickly obscuring his figure as he headed toward his own ranch. Only when she could no longer see him did she realize she was still wearing his coat, the same one he'd draped around her shoulders that first day at the train station. She'd offered to return it several times, but he always demurred, saying she needed it more than he did. The coat had become a comfort of sorts, its weight and warmth a constant reminder of that first kindness when she'd felt most alone. Beatrice pulled it tighter around herself now, inhaling the lingering scent of him before turning back into the house. Winter descended in earnest after that night, bringing both beauty and hardship to ranch life. The snow-covered landscape was breathtaking in its vastness, but the cold made every task more difficult. Frozen water troughs, cattle needing extra feed, the constant battle to keep paths clear all tested Beatrice's newfound resilience. Kurt was a daily presence now, often arriving before sunrise and staying until well after dark. The harsh conditions required them to work more closely together, and Beatrice found the reserve between them gradually thawing like the occasional midday sun on the snowdrifts. She learned about his childhood in Missouri, his journey west after the war, his dreams for expanding the ranch. In turn, she told him about her parents' shop in Boston, her education at the ladies' seminary, her brief engagement to a man who'd abandoned her when her family's finances collapsed after her father's death. His loss, Kurt said simply, when she related this last piece of her history. The words, spoken without sentiment but with absolute conviction, warmed her more than the fire they sat beside. Christmas approached, bringing a different kind of anticipation to their small household. Martha was determined they should celebrate properly, and even Kurt seemed caught up in her enthusiasm. He returned from a trip to town with small gifts for everyone and a pine tree strapped to his pack horse. Never had much use for Christmas decorations, he admitted as they set up the tree in the main room. But Martha was insistent. It's good for morale, Beatrice said, watching Martha and Thomas fashion ornaments from painted pine cones and strips of colored fabric. We all need something bright in the middle of winter, suppose we do. Kurt studied her face in the firelight. You've changed since you arrived. How so? Stronger, more sure of yourself, he hesitated. It suits you. Before she could respond to the unexpected compliment, Martha called them over to hang the first ornaments, and the moment passed. But Beatrice found herself revisiting his words that night as she lay in bed, wondering at the warm flutter they'd caused in her chest. Christmas Day dawned clear and cold. They exchanged modest gifts, a new scarf Kurt had ordered from the mercantile for Beatrice, hand-knitted mittens she'd made for him. Small treasures Martha and Thomas had crafted for everyone. The day held a festive air, with special foods Beatrice had carefully planned from their limited stores and stories shared around the fire. In the late afternoon, when Thomas and Martha went to check on the livestock, Beatrice found herself alone with Kurt. He seemed uncharacteristically hesitant, fidgeting with something in his pocket. "I have another gift for you," he finally said, extending a small package wrapped in brown paper. Wasn't sure about giving it with the others present. Curious, Beatrice unwrapped it to find a small book of poetry, Tennyson's verses, well worn but carefully maintained. "It was my wife's," Kurt said quietly. "Eleanor loved poetry, thought you might appreciate it too. I've seen you reading those old newspapers over and over for lack of anything else." Beatrice touched the book reverently, understanding the significance of such a gift. "Kurt, I'm honored, truly. But are you certain you want to part with it?" "Been sitting on my shelf gathering dust for 4 years," he replied, his voice gruff. "Books should be read. Eleanor would have liked you, I think." It was the most he'd ever said about his late wife. Beatrice felt a tightness in her throat as she carefully opened the volume, noting the delicate handwriting in the margins. "Thank you. I'll treasure it." Their eyes met, and something shifted between them, an acknowledgement of the growing connection neither had been willing to name. Before either could speak further, the door burst open as Martha and Thomas returned, bringing a gust of cold air and excited chatter about a deer they'd spotted near the creek. The moment passed, but something had changed. In the days that followed, Beatrice found Kurt watching her more often, his gaze thoughtful. For her part, she discovered herself looking forward to his arrival each morning with an anticipation that went beyond their working relationship. January brought a brutal cold snap that tested everyone's endurance. The temperature dropped so severely that Kurt insisted Thomas stay at his ranch rather than make the dangerous ride back and forth. For 3 days, Beatrice and Martha maintained the Owens place alone, fighting frozen pumps and tending to the few animals in the barn while praying the main herd, sheltered in a protected valley, would survive. On the 4th morning, Beatrice woke to find the temperature had plunged even further overnight. The windows were covered with thick frost patterns, and the fire had died to embers despite her efforts to bank it properly before bed. She had just managed to revive the flames when an urgent knocking sounded at the door. Kurt stood there, his face alarming in its gravity. "Martha needs to come with me," he said without preamble. "Thomas took a bad fall checking the north fence line. Broke his leg, I think. I've sent for the doctor, but Martha should be with him." "Of course," Beatrice said, immediately moving to wake the girl. Within minutes, Martha was bundled into Kurt's wagon, tearfully worried about her brother. "I'll come check on you when I can," Kurt promised Beatrice before they departed. "Keep the fire going and stay inside if possible." Alone at the ranch for the first time, Beatrice faced a day of solitary work. The isolation, combined with the brutal cold, made every task more challenging and somewhat frightening. If something happened to her out here, no one might know for hours. She had just finished feeding the horses in the barn when she heard the unmistakable sound of cattle in distress. Peering out, she saw that somehow a small group of steers had broken through a fence line and were now dangerously close to the frozen creek, unstable ice that could easily crack under their weight. Beatrice knew enough by now to understand the danger. Without thinking, she grabbed a rope and mounted her mare, riding out to head off the cattle before disaster struck. The wind cut through her clothing like knives, but she pressed on, remembering Kurt's lessons about herding techniques. For nearly an hour she struggled alone, managing to turn most of the steers back toward safer ground. But one young bull remained perilously close to the ice. As she maneuvered to drive him away, her horse stepped into a hidden snowdrift and stumbled, sending Beatrice tumbling into the snow. The fall knocked the wind from her lungs, and for terrifying seconds she could not breathe. By the time she regained her feet, her mare had trotted several yards away, and the cold had penetrated her clothes, which were now wet from the snow. With determination born of necessity, Beatrice caught her horse and completed the task, finally driving the last steer to safety. But the damage was done. She was wet, freezing, and still a quarter-mile from the house. The ride back seemed endless. By the time she reached the barn, her fingers were too numb to properly unsaddle the horse. She managed the basics of care before stumbling toward the house, her body shivering violently. Inside, she struggled to remove her frozen outer garments, her fingers clumsy and painful as circulation slowly returned. The house, with the fire untended during her absence, had grown cold. Beatrice added wood with shaking hands, then wrapped herself in a quilt, huddling before the slowly reviving flames. She must have dozed, for the next thing she knew, the door was opening and Kurt was striding in, bringing a blast of cold air and the scent of snow. Beatrice. He took in her huddled form, the discarded wet clothing, and was beside her in an instant. What happened? Through chattering teeth, she explained about the cattle. Kurt's expression shifted from concern to something like anger mixed with admiration. You could have frozen to death, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Why didn't you wait for me? The cattle wouldn't have waited, she replied simply. Kurt stared at her for a long moment, then began removing his coat, the heavy winter one he wore now, not the canvas duster she'd kept. Without a word, he wrapped it around her, adding its warmth to the quilt. You're the most stubborn, surprising woman I've ever known, he murmured, his hands lingering on her shoulders. I rode out here terrified I'd find you hurt or worse, and instead you've been saving my livestock single-handed. Beatrice managed a small smile, warmed as much by his words as by his coat. Our livestock. That was our agreement, wasn't it? Kurt's eyes searched her face. Then, with deliberate care, he reached out and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear, his fingers gentle against her cheek. Beatrice. I think our agreement might need some renegotiation. Before she could ask what he meant, he was building up the fire, moving with efficient purpose. First we get you properly warm, then we talk. The next hour passed in a kind of dreamlike state for Beatrice. Kurt prepared hot coffee, insisted she change into dry clothes, and checked her fingers and toes for signs of frostbite. His concern was touching, his competence reassuring. By the time they sat together at the table, a hot meal between them, Beatrice felt almost herself again. Thomas will be fine, Kurt reported as they ate. Clean break, Doc said it properly. Martha's staying with him at my place until he can move about better. I'm glad, Beatrice said, and grateful for your help today. Kurt set down his fork. About that renegotiation I mentioned. He took a deep breath. When I offered you this arrangement, I thought it was purely practical, a way to help you and help myself at the same time. Beatrice waited, her heart suddenly beating faster, but these past months. Kurt struggled visibly with the words. Seeing you take to ranch life, watching you face every challenge with that stubborn chin of yours raised. He met her eyes directly. I've developed feelings that go well beyond a business partnership. The confession hung in the air between them. Beatrice felt a flush rise to her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from a surge of emotion she'd been suppressing for weeks. Kurt, she began carefully, when I came west, I thought my heart was closed. After losing my parents, being abandoned by my fiancé, then arriving to find Franklin dead. I didn't believe I could trust or hope again. She reached across the table, covering his hand with her own. But you've shown me otherwise. Your kindness that first day, your patience teaching me, your respect for my independence. She smiled softly. I've developed feelings too. The tension visibly left Kurt's shoulders. Then perhaps. He turned his hand to clasp hers. Perhaps we should consider a different sort of partnership. What did you have in mind, Mr. Whitaker? Beatrice asked, her voice teasing despite the seriousness of the moment. Marriage, he said simply. Not right away, when you're ready, when we're both sure. The word hung between them, weighty, significant, full of promise and challenge. I'd need time, Beatrice said honestly. This isn't what I expected when I came west. Nor I when I offered you this arrangement, Kurt agreed. But sometimes life offers better than we planned. He squeezed her hand gently. I'm not asking for an answer tonight, just consideration. I can promise that much, she replied, her smile growing. Consideration and honesty about where my heart leads. The blizzard that had been threatening all day descended in full force that night, making it impossible for Kurt to return to his ranch. They maintained propriety, with Kurt sleeping on a pallet near the fire while Beatrice took her bedroom. But there was a new awareness between them, a sense of possibilities opening where before there had been only practical considerations. In the morning, the world was transformed, blanketed in white so deep that the familiar landscape was rendered alien and beautiful. They stood together on the porch, surveying the changed world. "We're snowed in for at least a day," Kurt observed. "Maybe two." "Then we have time," Beatrice said, turning to face him. "Time to talk more about this. Renegotiation." Kurt smiled then, the first full, unguarded smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his face, softening the weathered lines and bringing light to his eyes. Without thinking, Beatrice raised a hand to touch his cheek, feeling the rough stubble beneath her fingers. "I'd like that," he said, covering her hand with his own. The days of enforced isolation became a gift. Freed from the constant demands of ranch work by the impassable snow, they talked as never before. Kurt told her about Alina, their childhood friendship, their young marriage, the devastating loss that had driven him deeper into his work and away from connections with others. Beatrice shared more about her family, her dreams before hardship changed her path, her fears and hopes for the future. By the time the snow had melted enough to clear paths to the barn and eventually between the two ranches, something profound had shifted between them. The business partners had become friends, and the friends were cautiously, deliberately becoming something more. Martha and Thomas returned once travel was possible, bringing new energy to the household. Martha, with her keen eye, immediately sensed the change between Kurt and Beatrice, though she said nothing directly. February passed in a rhythm of work and weather, with Kurt now taking supper at the Owens Ranch most evenings. Occasionally, he would bring his fiddle, an unexpected talent he'd kept private until now, and play after the meal, filling the house with music that seemed to speak directly to Beatrice's heart. On one such evening, as Thomas and Martha retired early, Kurt set aside his instrument and moved to sit beside Beatrice on the small sofa. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low, "about the future." Beatrice nodded, encouraging him to continue. "Frank's nephew wrote last week," Kurt revealed. "He's selling the ranch, wants me to handle it since I know the property." The news struck Beatrice like a physical blow. "So soon?" "But I thought, I know," Kurt reached for her hand, "but here's what I'm thinking. I buy this place, add it to mine like I've always wanted to. The creek between them makes it a natural expansion." "And what of me?" Beatrice asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Where do I fit in this plan?" Kurt's eyes held hers intently. "Wherever you choose. As my wife, building something together. Or if you're not ready for that, continuing our current arrangement until you decide." The moment stretched between them, full of possibility and uncertainty. "I don't need an answer tonight," Kurt added gently. "Just wanted you to know what's coming so you can consider all options." Beatrice nodded, grateful for his understanding. "When must the decision be made?" "The sale, within the month." Kurt hesitated. "The other matter, that's entirely in your hands." That night, alone in her room, Beatrice took out Alina's book of poetry, running her fingers over the delicate handwriting in the margins. Somehow, it felt like seeking counsel from the woman who had loved Kurt first. A folded paper slipped from between the pages, a letter she hadn't noticed before, addressed to the woman who comes after. With trembling fingers, Beatrice unfolded it. The letter, dated shortly before Alina's death, was brief but powerful. She had known she might not survive childbirth. There had been complications with a previous pregnancy, and had written this in preparation. In it, she released Kurt from grief and encouraged him to find happiness again, to share the goodness of his heart rather than lock it away in mourning. Tears streamed down Beatrice's face as she read the final lines. Love him fully, whoever you are, for he deserves nothing less. And know that somewhere, I am grateful to you for bringing him back to life. Morning found Beatrice clear-eyed and resolved. When Kurt arrived, she asked him to walk with her along the creek that divided their properties. The February air was crisp, but hinted at the coming spring, with patches of ground beginning to emerge from beneath the snow. I've made my decision, she said when they reached the water, partially frozen but with a clear current running beneath the ice. About all of it. Kurt waited, his expression careful, giving her space to continue. I came west seeking security through marriage to a stranger, Beatrice began. When that plan failed, I thought I'd lost everything. Instead, I found something I never expected: strength in myself, joy in this land, and, she took a deep breath, love, with you. The hope that dawned on Kurt's face gave her courage to continue. If your offer stands, I choose to stay not as your employee or partner in business, but as your wife. Building something together, as you said. Kurt stepped closer, taking her gloved hands in his. You're certain? Ranch life is hard, Beatrice. There will be days when you question everything. I'm certain of you, she answered simply. The rest we'll face together. He pulled her gently into his arms, his embrace tentative at first, then firmer as she leaned into him. When their lips met, the kiss held all the promise of their shared future, tender but strong, like the man himself. I love you, Kurt murmured against her hair when they finally parted. Have for months now, though I hardly dared admit it even to myself. I love you too, Beatrice replied, the words feeling right, natural, as if she'd been meant to say them all along. They were married in April, when the first wildflowers dotted the meadows and the cattle had begun to calve. The ceremony in Snowflake's small church was attended by what seemed like the entire community, all curious about the mail-order bride who hadn't married her intended, but had found love nonetheless. Beatrice wore a simple dress of pale blue silk ordered from back east with Kurt's encouragement, and carried spring blossoms gathered by Martha that morning. Kurt, looking somewhat uncomfortable in his best suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle. The Reverend, who had counseled Beatrice those many months ago, performed the ceremony with evident satisfaction. When he pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the assembled townsfolk reflected their approval of this union that had developed so unexpectedly. The celebration continued at the newly expanded Whitaker Ranch, where Kurt had spent the winter adding rooms to his house in preparation for their marriage. The main house on what had been the Owens property would serve as a home for Thomas and eventually Martha, who had both decided to stay on permanently as part of the ranch operations. As twilight fell and the last guests departed, Beatrice stood on the porch of her new home, Kurt's arm around her waist. The land stretched before them, vast and full of promise in the golden evening light. Happy? Kurt asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. More than I ever imagined possible, Beatrice replied honestly. She turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to trace the beloved lines of his face. When I sat crying at that station, I thought my life was ending. Instead, it was just beginning. Kurt smiled, the expression now familiar and treasured. I'm glad I had the sense to tell you to stay. As am I, Beatrice agreed, rising on tiptoes to kiss him properly. As am I. The years that followed brought challenges, as ranch life inevitably did. Droughts, harsh winters, fluctuating cattle prices all tested the Whitakers' resilience. But there were joys too, profound and lasting. The birth of their first child, a son they named James, followed 2 years later by twin daughters, Alina and Catherine. The gradual expansion of the ranch into one of the territories most successful operations. The deep, abiding partnership that grew between them with each passing season. On their 10th anniversary, Kurt presented Beatrice with a gift, the deed to the original Owens property, now officially in her name. "You earned it," he said simply. "That first winter, when you chose to stay and fight for a place that wasn't even truly yours yet." Beatrice, holding their youngest child, a second son named Michael, smiled at the memory. "I was fighting for more than land, though I didn't fully understand it then." "As was I," Kurt agreed, gathering their older children close as they clamored for attention. "Best decision I ever made, covering a crying woman with my coat and telling her to stay." As evening settled over their home, with children's laughter filling the rooms and the vast Arizona sky turning to purple and gold beyond the windows, Beatrice reflected on the strange, winding path that had brought her here. From desperate mail-order bride to respected rancher's wife and mother, from Eastern City girl to woman of the West, the transformation seemed both miraculous and inevitable. Later, with the children asleep and the house quiet, she and Kurt sat together on the porch swing he'd built years ago, watching the stars emerge. His arm around her shoulders still felt like shelter, like coming home. "Any regrets?" Kurt asked, a question he posed on occasion, always with the same gentle seriousness. Beatrice leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and pine and home. "Not one," she answered truthfully. "Every tear led me here, to you, to us. How could I regret that?" Kurt's arms tightened around her, and together they rocked gently. Watching the night deepen over the land, they both loved the unexpected legacy of a mail-order arrangement gone awry, and a cowboy's simple command to stay.